Okay. Do you want me to kick it off? Okay. Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everyone. Ko Marty Hoffert toko ingoa, no Canada, oko tupuna, ke te noho o ki taronga moana, ka pai. Good morning, everyone. Ata Marty. My name is Marty Hoffert. I'm the current chair of the Zero Waste Network, and it is my privilege to introduce our presenter today, Robert Kelman from Australia. You're here in the container return session, talking about container return schemes. And so Rob Kelman has worked on waste and recycling issues for the past 20 years and currently is executive officer of the Australian Tire Recyclers Association and director of Reloop Pacific. If you want to have a look on Google Reloop Pacific. Reloop is a small global organization focused on better circular economy outcomes for plastics and other materials. The Reloop work includes developing and implementing container return schemes, single-use plastic phase-outs, increased recycled content, better data capture, and reinstating reusable packaging into the economy. Rob was contracted to New Zealand's Technical Advisory Group for the container return scheme last year, and that was by the government. And the Technical Advisory Group sat above the container return scheme working group. So they were the sort of the technical experts in between the production of the report and the research and handing over to the minister. Rob will outline global best practice on DRS or deposit return schemes. You know, there's a whole bunch of names for these things. And some of the lessons learned from Australia as Aotearoa shuffles towards implementing a container return scheme. So with no further ado, Robbie, if you're ready to roll, we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks Marty. Kia ora everyone. Yeah, I'm coming to you from Hobart in Tasmania today. It's a beautiful day, about 7 degrees, but no wind. So there you go. And it's always a pleasure to re-engage in Aotearoa. I lived in Auckland for a year back in about 2001 or something. Must have been 2002. So thanks for having me today. So yeah, Marty's just touched on Reloop. As I say, as Marty said, I also work with the Australian Tire Recyclers Association in all that kind of space. And in addition to the work in New Zealand, I've also been on every advisory group in Australia, every state advisory group over the last sort of 6-7 years. And we're still working through a couple of schemes in Australia, and I'll come to that a little bit later. And I've also been making a contribution in Hong Kong and in Singapore, where we're, as part of a consortium, shortlisted to help the Yeah, I've just been asked to do a bit of an overview on DRS. We'll call it DRS for the time being, which is deposit return schemes. Container deposit schemes, CDS is another way that it's termed. These schemes are growing rapidly. There's over 40 jurisdictions around the world. When I say jurisdictions, that includes states in the US, provinces in Canada, and of course, countries throughout the EU. And Australia would be the first continent to have a full coverage once we have Tasmania and Victoria adopting schemes. And that should be all done by 2023, at some point in 2023. A big driver for new schemes is the EU directive for 90% plastic recovery by 2029. So a lot of new EU states are looking at schemes. Some of the older EU states like France and Spain and Italy haven't had DRS And most of those are now in some sort of a process, as well as a bunch of the new Eastern Bloc kind of EU states who have adopted in the last couple of years or are looking to adopt. Romania, Lithuania adopted a scheme in the last few years, etc. The European schemes are by far the best globally. There are a couple of good schemes in the US, but really, if you're looking for best practice, you look towards the EU, as we do so much for environmental policy. Germany has a return rate of around about 98%. The Netherlands is around about 95%. And there's a couple of factors that contribute to that really good outcome. Interestingly, some US states are now reforming. Those states really, there's about 11 states in the US that adopted schemes, but they're old and they haven't been modernized. And these are schemes that you need to sort of stay up to date with. The most obvious example is the inflationary impact on the refund. And a lot of the refunds across the US are like 5 US cents, maybe 10 cents. And they're really inadequate as a motivator for the consumer to sort of interact with them. And there's lots of stories about how California has really just been, gutted really as a sort of a scheme, and, non-compliance and all sorts of things. And again, I think the refund there is still 5 cents. So again, very poor. But there is some movement towards reform, and we have a person in the US now who's sort of involved in that sort of reform program. The Aotearoa situation is uncertain. My understanding from feedback, and I'm sure some of you will be more across this than I am, is that the Minister Parker is interested, but there's no cabinet decision yet. And that's the next step, that the minister has to take a paper to cabinet and then go out to consultation. But that hasn't occurred yet. So anything that you're all doing around public communications, is all to the good, I think. And it's worth bearing in mind as we go through this presentation that there's really, well, I guess there's only one real determinant of a successful scheme, and that's a high recycling rate. So a high recycling rate up in the mid-90s is really what we should be seeking, I think. And what does that deliver us? It delivers us maximized circular economy outcomes, in that we get maximum quantities of clean recyclate back through into reprocessing for bottle-to-bottle recycling. And if we are running reusable, refillable agendas at the same time, again, we're wanting as many of those bottles back as possible for refilling. And I think that refilling agenda in New Zealand is a really exciting one, and we don't have that. So I'm really sort of keen to make sure that stays on the agenda in New Zealand, so that we then deliver recycled content outcomes for the bottles, and producers are generally wanting that to occur as well. We're maximizing litter reductions, and really importantly, we're guaranteeing the return of the refund for the consumer. In general, there is a price increase on eligible containers under a DRS. And so, consumer is paying a little bit more, whatever that might be, and they want to get their refund back. So maximizing returns is the #1 objective of a successful scheme. So best practice DRS, there's 2 real primary drivers for successful. Obviously, the refund has to be adequate. And Australia's refund at 10 cents is pathetic. And certainly in the conversations we've been involved with over in New Zealand, get trapped into a 10-cent kind of game, if you like, albeit producers prefer a lower refund value because it gets lower returns. But I'll go into that detail in a little bit. And a very convenient collection network. it's interesting over here, there's now a conversation around how to get our COVID vaccination rates up, and convenience is one of the things that health professionals are talking about, needing to ensure that we get upwards of 80 and 90% sort of vaccination rates for COVID. And so you've got this sort of global health pandemic which is, you know, life-threatening, and you still need convenience for some portion of the population to engage in getting vaccinated. Well, look, if you're talking about a 10 or 20 cent refund, it's pretty obvious that convenience is a really important factor. And of course, beverage producers, you know, they put these vending machines on train stations or at bus malls or at really sort of obvious convenient places because they know that will drive sales. So it's not rocket science. Number one, you know, one of the biggest driver is making sure that the collection network is accessible for the consumer. And it's arguable that that's most important. If you look at Michigan, it's got a 10 cent refund, which is pretty low, but they have a 90% collection rate because they have a very convenient, high penetration of collection networks. And I'll go into some detail around that in a little while. I mean, of course, if you had $1, if your refund value in New Zealand was $1, you'd get 99% collection rates if you had a collection point in Wellington and Christchurch, right? Because there'd be such a driver to get that material back. It's never going to be $1. Let's be sensible about it. It needs to be a decent level of refund. And the combination of those two things is what's going to deliver a really good outcome. So it needs to be a mix of sites. It needs to be, so what does convenience mean? It means different things for different people to some degree. You need to make sure that the vast majority of sort of, you know, consumers can access refund points at retail locations where they go naturally. They're taking their plastic bags back. They're going shopping. It's not unreasonable to think that you might take your bottles back at the same time and make it part of your sort of day-to-day or week-to-week shopping activities. They need to be open when people aren't working necessarily. You know, people are working 9 to 5 or whatever. So you need to make sure opening hours are there on weekends and in the evenings in some cases. And you also need to have a number of sites. And I'll go into some detail around the sort of pathetic nature of the Australian schemes, which New Zealand should not replicate, in terms of the population to refund or collection point sort of ratio. So it'll be a mix. You need to have depots. You need to have reverse vending machines at retail locations. You need to have charitable involvement, of course, if that's applicable for those charities. Day-to-day consumers dropping off 20 containers, and then you've got your pile.
You're on mute, Dorda.
I feel like it's not just me that's lost Robbie, right?
Yeah, he was sort of bumping in and out a little bit. I'm not sure what's up with his connection.
Okay, we do seem to have lost him. Hopefully he'll come back any minute now. Should we have a look at some of the questions? Maybe we can do some group thinking around those questions.
Sure. I mean, there's one in from Betsy. The first question, Betsy Kettle: if the cost of recycling plastic containers is higher than using virgin plastic, how is the use? Oh, here we go. I think we're going to have Robbie back now.
Hey, Rob.
Hi, everyone. Am I back now?
You're back. Over to you. Oh.
Anyway, I did hear that you were going to go through some questions.
No, we'll wait, Robbie. You finish your presentation and we'll go through questions at the end.
You're back, but it's not great, Robbie. Marty, I think let's just take a little bit of a break with some questions.
Okay. First question we had was from Betsy Kettle. If the cost of recycling plastic containers is higher than using virgin plastic, how is the use of recycled plastic incentivized? So I guess at the moment it isn't. But incentivizing the use of virgin plastic, Betsy, you can have a minimum recycled content that is required in all new plastic bottles. So if say you've got a minimum of 30% or 40% recycled content to make new bottles from old bottles, that incentivizes the purchase and the price increase for recycled content. So there's certainly a way to do it.
Rob, can you hear us?
I think I can probably go back. If there's any other questions in the chat box, we can go on with that. Otherwise, do you want me to speak to Robbie's presentation, or is he his PowerPoint's there, but he's not, right?
I think he is there. I've suggested turning off his camera because sometimes it's a bandwidth thing, but I can't hear him either. Robbie, can you just tell us can you just say some stuff? Or maybe respond to me in the chat. Oh.
I'll just fill in a bit of space until Robbie comes back. I think what Robbie was talking about in the United States is when the return rate, or when the price paid for beverage containers is so low, people will tend to not bother to bring them in for a refund. And that's why in New Zealand, there's no price set yet. We don't know what the price point is. 10 cents is a world average. But in Germany, it's up around 40 cents, and that's why they have a 98% return rate. So the higher the deposit, and the more return depots, the more convenient it is, the higher the rates of return. So that's something that is in the report for our minister to consider.
Sorry, everybody. We've definitely got some technical issues. I'm not entirely sure what the best thing to do is here. We could potentially just give it 5 minutes and hope that his internet gets better.
Yeah, or I mean, we can open it up to anyone have any other questions about our current scheme, as where it's at. Why hasn't the government made an announcement yet? When would it roll out? Happy to entertain some of those questions. Okay. So basically where our scheme is at the moment is that it wrapped up last October. So that was 2020. And that report was 800 pages of it was handed into the Ministry for the Environment. And it is now under consideration from the minister as to the next move for that one. But it will be a long road yet, because what'll have to happen is Cabinet will have to approve it. And it will need to go to Treasury to see how it will impact our economy. You know, you're talking 2 or 3 months here and 2 or 3 months there. Then there'll be another public consultation, and then by law, I believe the manufacturers have to be given 12 months lead time to change their labeling. So, or the whole thing could get shelved and into the shredder. So, you know, there's no guarantee that we're going to have one. I mean, it could go anywhere. So that's where it's at the moment. So it's going to be a couple of years probably. I don't believe there's been. So that's Graham Burrell. There's been no formal statement from the minister yet as to how and when any of that will happen. So no, it's all just a waiting game at the moment to to find out when the next announcement will go. I don't believe there's anyone on the call. We've got 70 on the call today, but not sure if there's any MFE people here, but I'm not sure they'll be able to tell us any more than that at this stage. Any other questions from anyone?
Can you hear me now?
You're back on, Robbie. You
Okay.
carry on.
And the video is working?
The video is working.
Okay.
The video is working with an interesting voice.
Yeah. We've got a voiceover, so that's great.
Okay. Okay. So we're good to go.
Yes.
All right. Okay. I don't know. Apologies for that. I've gone on a hotspot. Anyway, so what I was saying, and thanks for filling in there, there's a whole range of factors which lead to a best practice DRS. And at the core of all of this is, though, an appropriate governance framework, which I'll come to. Let me touch on the Australian schemes. And I think this is important because as neighbours, it might be that the New Zealand government sort of looks to the left across the ditch and thinks, well, maybe we could replicate something in Australia. But as we proceed with the sort of policy development, let's try and avoid that as much as possible. And let me explain why. Australian ministers did obligate producers. So producers are legislated to pay out a refund. All right, but they're not legislated to allocate a deposit. It might be a bit of a technicality for the real wonks in the group. I'm happy to sort of go through that if you like, but it basically means we have a refund scheme rather than a deposit scheme. The real effect of that is that there's no big pool of what we call unredeemed deposits to fund the scheme, okay? Maybe it's a technicality. It is sort of important, but let's not dwell on it too much today. So they did obligate producers, and there's legislation and some targets and all these sort of things. But what they didn't do, which is what all of Europe does, is also obligate retailers as part of a product stewardship scheme to take containers back. What that means is that then someone has to decide on the nature of the collection network. Now, you've got two models which have emerged in Australia. The first model that came out, aside from the South Australian scheme, which started sort of 40 years ago, or was held in place 40 years ago, was New South Wales recognised the conflict of interest in having beverage producers decide on the collection network. They then set up an alternate approach, which was they contracted a scheme coordinator, which is really the beverage industry. And then they separately went to the market and sought expressions of interest and tenders for the collection network. And they did that because they wanted to decide on the collection network, not leave it to, frankly, Coca-Cola, who really runs the sort of policy agenda here on this particular issue. So they contracted the collection network. They divided the state of New South Wales into sort of 9 different zones. In the end, they decided on a single entity to run the whole scheme, set up the collection points, subcontract for others to be part of the network, and for a logistics supplier to do the pickup and all those sort of things. So that's one model. That's the model that's now been adopted in Tasmania and in Victoria. But an alternate model emerged after New South Wales, which was in Queensland, whereby the Queensland government simply handed the whole thing over to the beverage industry to run effectively. Now, there's some legislative underpinnings, the eligibility of the containers, the refund value is legislated. There is a target of 85%, but there's not really a great penalty regime, right? So you need to hold these sort of schemes to account. And the reality is that the savings available for an underperforming schemes are so enormous that any sort of penalty regime at a government level, unless it's something like doubling the deposit value, like a really big kind of scheme change, is really not going to have that much impact. So that scheme governance model has been replicated in Western Australia. and so we call the New South Wales scheme a split responsibility model. But and there's a single model in Queensland and WA. So the issue is that in the Queensland model, it leaves the decisions around the collection network to a disinterested party. And I'll just give you one figure, and this is something that's going to be really important as things proceed in New Zealand, which is that for every 10% less recycling, so if you're getting a scheme that's getting 70% recycling instead of 80%, or 80% instead of 90%, just in the state of Victoria, for every 10% less recycling every year, that will save drink producers about $50 million. So you can see it's huge, huge money. And from memory, I think in New Zealand, we're talking about, daughter Marty, about 3 billion containers per annum.
2.3. So same as Queensland, roughly.
Yes, okay. So it's roughly the same sort of saving. It's going to be in the order of about $40 million annually that the beverage industry doesn't have to pay out in terms of refunds or in terms of the recycling fees if they can get a lower return rate. And so what we've seen in Australia is quite big public campaigns. They've established these sort of fake front groups called Tas Recycle and Vic Recycle, which are owned by Coca-Cola and Lion, and they run these media campaigns and put ads, and the objective is to keep the return rate low. If you're not paying back your 10 or 20 cents, that's a huge amount of money on a $2 can of Coke, for instance, right? And what's the strategy there? The strategy there is to create an inconvenient network, right? So the deposit's set, but they can then determine the network, and the effect of it is to make it as inconvenient as possible for the consumer. So just as an example, we have the ratio to collection points in Australia are really bad. In New South Wales, they are better, 1 per 12,000 people. In Queensland, it's 1 per 16,000 people, but there is some analysis that in southeast Queensland around Brisbane, the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, all that sort of area, the ratio of collection points to population in some areas can be as low as 1 per 30,000 people. Now, if you look overseas to Europe, you've got 1 per 600 people, 1 per 1,000 people, that kind of level of penetration of refund points. And the other factors here are like the full-time nature of the refund points. So in New South Wales, you see 4 or 5 times more collection points that are full-time, open, 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. every day, that kind of thing. So you do see a lot more convenient network under that split model, because the recycling industry is appointed to run the collection networks. They get the handling fee, and they're motivated to get as many of those containers back as possible because of the money involved. Whereas under an alternate approach in Queensland, they don't want to be paying out that money. So the collection network is not as open as much. It's much more depot based. There's very little penetration in terms of retail based collection. So that's the approach. So this is going to the producer agenda. I mean, my conversations in New Zealand are, you want a convenient network run by the professional industry, some sort of combination of, you've got a really good network of zero waste based depots. I've seen a couple fantastically set up to collect containers, part of communities, all of that sort of stuff. You should have some level of retail-based collection as well to make it convenient for the consumers that don't access that kind of network, and built up areas where land is expensive, all of those sort of things. Smaller towns probably have, if you've got towns of 500 people, 1,000 people, you might just have an over-the-counter facility. And of course, you're going to have some level of community sector participation. Charities, New South Wales has Vinnie's. I'm not sure if you've got, do you have Vinnie's, St Vincent de Paul? Anyway, it's a big charity here. You know, they have big shops where they sell clothes and all sorts of household goods. The money goes back to all of the good works that they do, and they have a business. So they run 6 or 7 big depots across New South Wales. They employ disadvantaged people, and they you know, they funnel the profits back into their activities. But what's really important to watch here is what Coke and the sort of producers have done is managed to conflate a recycling scheme, an environmental scheme, which we all want to see, getting rid of litter, getting rid of plastics from the oceans, and high return rates to get materials back for recycling and all those sort of things. And they've conflated that politically with a charitable sector kind of an agenda. So they go out and have run very misleading campaigns telling sporting groups and, you know, other charitable and community sector groups that they can't have any involvement in these split responsibility schemes. And then they all sort of start to lobby government on sort of Coke's behalf to try and, you know, sort of influence all of that. So it's been quite a big thing. And I'm telling you now, I've already seen, and I recall seeing an article from New Zealand a month or so ago, someone, I think it was Retail New Zealand or Beverages Council New Zealand, I can't remember which one it was. And they said, oh, well, we want to have a scheme that's, you know, that has maximizes, you know, community sector participation. It's pretty hard to argue with, but you've got to have some sort of a combination. And just bear in mind that this is a very strong agenda and quite strong politics too, right? It's pretty hard to sort of get around that. But again, what's the agenda? Low return rates, an less convenient network, and frankly, at the end of the day, it's about money. It's about saving money. It's about not paying back the refund and all those sort of things. So it's all about scheme control. It's something we're going to have to sort of watch out for. And after this very sort of disjointed and truncated presentation, everyone knows, of course, in this network, we've got the problem of glass and the glass lobby. And again, really worth watching for, because we do not want to leave glass out of this. And interestingly, Coke, who really just use PET, don't want to see glass left out if a scheme does actually come in as well. So again, apologies for all of the difficulties there, but and let's see if we can take some questions. Thanks.
Awesome. I'll just, Marty, you facilitate, but maybe just to do some process stuff, we thought people could ask their questions themselves. So if you'd like to just put your hand up, I can start directing people to you, but I think there are a couple of questions that you could take, Marty. And maybe, Rob, I'll get you to stop sharing your screen so we can see people talking.
Yeah.
Marty, you are on mute and your camera is off. Hopefully you're actually there. I will just go through and
I am actually here, Dorda. Sorry, I was just trying to find the latest about the glass industry wanting to oppose and be out of the scheme, but we'll do that later. Anyway, so where are we starting? Robbie, if I could ask the first question, then Robbie, what do we need to be wary of? I mean, in New Zealand right now, if you were saying this is the scheme that you want in this country, what is the scheme we want, Robbie? What are the numbers we want for collection points? 1 per 1,000, 1 per 5,000. You mentioned that the summer as high as 1 per 16,000. So what are some good average collection points? And what are some things that, you know, we should have in our scheme to make it a world-leading scheme?
Yeah, thanks, Marty. I do think that ratio is really important. But you've also got to look at this. There's this qualitative issue there, but there's a quantitative issue in terms of numbers of points, but there's a qualitative issue as well. I think you've got to utilize your existing network. That makes total sense. And it might be that you can build on that network. I mean, look, I always tell the story of going to the Raglan zero waste site, and you know, just very inspiring, everything that's happening in those sort of locations. And you can see large volumes of containers coming back through that kind of network. And there'll be people who do their sort of day-to-day kind of drop off. But I also think it might be in somewhere like Raglan, you might have a collection point down at I think there's a countdown from memory down at you know, in town. So you might have another collection point in that particular area, you know, for the consumers that aren't going to the zero waste site, for instance, right? But you can imagine in a place like that, the restaurants and the pubs are all delivering large volumes back through Rick's, I think, is it Rick? Yeah. You know, back through that sort of facility. So, you know, so again, and I can't remember, maybe there's sort of, are there about 5,000 permanent residents in somewhere like Raglan? So to use an example, it's just that I surf. So I go there when I'm on a business trip. And, but I think, you know, it's a big sort of holiday sort of destination, all those sort of things as well. But it's a good example of where you'd probably have a couple of facilities, you know, in a sort of town like that. But you've got to cater to the consumer that doesn't engage in that network, you know, like, and there are lots of those as well. And they want to be able to make it really convenient, like even for 20 cents. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to start to run an agenda in Australia to get our refund up to 20 cents, which is reasonable. You've got to start there too, I think, Marty. To start at 10 cents just means you're so behind the 8 ball. But bear in mind, producers are big. Yeah, they're big. We know how big they are in terms of political clout and the influence they've had over this policy issue for the last 20 years. And they will be making all sorts of claims around cost of living impacts of a 20 cent and, you know, these kinds of things. But to start at 10, I think in New Zealand would be wrong. It might be that 1 per 5,000 is possibly about right. You know, that might be that there's, I couldn't do the maths. Maybe there's 400 or 500 sites throughout the whole country to sort of achieve that. It might be a few more. I can't remember. But yeah, so, and I think in that regard, what you really need to underpinning all of that is a really appropriate governance framework. And making sure that producers aren't in control of the scheme. So government really needs to stay really on top of this, and just to hand it over, really like Queensland did, was a mistake. In fact, a global mistake. I mean, Queensland return rates are sitting at around about 60%. If you look, Lithuania started a scheme, and it's often used as an example. 10 euro cents. I mean, their GDP is not nearly as high as New Zealand's, but they were at 92% within 18 months.
Robbie, I've got quite a few questions coming in the chat box, so I think it'll be quicker if I ask them to you rather than we get somebody to unmute and ask it themselves. So I've got one from Susie. So if you just want to maybe give quick sort of 2-minute answers on these, we can get through several. Yeah. What is the best option for rurally isolated towns? I know you were talking about Raglan, but let's talk about somewhere more rural than that, like maybe pop-ups and things like that. Do they work? What's your thoughts?
You can, yeah. I mean, in a small town of say 500 people, say in Northland or somewhere, you know, there are a few of those, yeah. You might just have an over-the-counter. In those sort of populations, I think people may be a bit less demanding in terms of their willingness to travel, but often in those sort of places too, you might have an op shop that can take containers simply as an over-the-counter sort of thing. You know, people just have a bag they fill the bag, and maybe they have a registration, so they're putting a tag. The collectors come through once a week or whatever it is on their runs, pick up the bag, and it might be that consumers get paid their refunds, you know, through some sort of, you know, an app or you know, PayPal or something like this. Or it might be that that particular facility is willing to give out cash as long as it's safe and all those sort of things. But in smaller places, 500 to 1,000 people, you're probably not going to have much more than, say, what we call an over-the-counter facility, which is an existing enterprise. But again, if you've got a zero waste network, you know, depot in that kind of region, then yeah, you'd obviously utilize those sort of facilities.
Thanks, Robbie. Got another one for you. So this question is, I'm interested to know what containers are included worldwide in a container return scheme. Is it limited to plastic bottles? So just go through, Robbie, what generally is accepted.
Yeah, they differ. Certainly in Australia, we've got everything included except wine and spirits in glass. That's an historic legacy from the South Australian scheme. We didn't have wine because South Australia is a big wine region, and I think they just lobbied to stay out of it, right? But I think you should have everything as much as possible, but they vary. There are some European states that don't have glass. Most of them do have PET and aluminium. And I think, again, for New Zealand, we want to be pushing to have everything in, because it does create a difference between materials, and there can be material shifting. And I think one of the other big question marks is Tetra, right? Everyone talks about liquid paper board and the problems of recycling Tetra. So that's another challenge.
I've got another question here, Robbie. Could our community recycling center, oh, they're coming in fast, sorry. Could our running of return RVMs or return vending machines, or does it need to be managed by a larger company or owned by a supermarket? Like talk a little bit about RVMs or reverse vending machines. I know I come from Alberta, and there are none in Alberta, and we've had that scheme for 40 years. But I see they have a place. So if you can just talk a little bit about how reverse vending machines could work here, and could individuals or consumers own them or operate them?
So there's two sort of models. The way it often happens in Europe is that the supermarkets are obligated to take containers back. They could just do that manually through the checkout, but then they go, well, we don't really want a whole lot of containers sitting at the back of the checkout. So they then buy machines. There's 5 or 6 different companies around the world that make these machines. And then they set up maintenance agreements and all that sort of stuff. And they actually get paid part of the handling fee. The retailer gets the handling fee to pay off the machine and all those sort of things, to pay off the lease space for the staff to clean them and all that sort of stuff. So there is an ownership model there. There is also a model whereby the companies themselves can own the machines. Well, they do own them. They put them into facilities. And then they do the maintenance and all those sort of things. It depends on the volume of throughput. What we see in Australia, though, is the New South Wales model is very automated, in that every single container is counted with the barcode or other sort of recognition technology. So the depots have these big machines where someone comes along, literally backs up their ute or whatever it might be, pours in bags and bags into these big sort of machines, and then they spin out and they go glass, aluminium, plastic over there, and then they scan the barcode on the way and they count, and then that person is given their refund value there and then.
So they're like a bulk counter.
It's just a bulk counter, and again, there's numerous companies that sort of make these sort of scanning facilities. So
okay, I got a local government question here for you. Thank you, Sophie. What impact does a DRS have on the contents of a curbside recycling collection? Is it simple enough to expect that curbside recycling collection frequency can just be decreased? How does it affect curbside, Robbie?
Look, it's a huge volume of material comes out of the curbside scheme, for sure. And importantly for local government, of course, as you think about this, a huge volume of material comes out of your litter collection network as well, out of your bins in parks, out of your bins at beaches, and just from the environment. So there's litter savings that always come out in these cost benefit analysis. But then for sure, there's something between 11 and 20% of remnant eligible containers remain within the curbside bin. And unfortunately, what we're seeing with a lot of these schemes now in Australia is people are just going, look, I did engage with the kids for the first year, but for 10 cents, I can't be bothered. So I'm just going back into my curbside bin. In Australia, what we've done though, is that any container left in the curbside bin is worth the 10 or the 20 cents, all right? So the value of the remnant material has gone from what, nothing for glass, maybe half a cent for PET, maybe 1 to 2 cents, I'm not sure, for aluminium, to 10 cents plus the material value, right? And if you've got a 20-cent scheme, your remnant material, and again, local government, I think you should be lobbying for this, you retain the value of that refund for anything left. So that container that is left is worth a huge amount now, and there's a revenue sharing agreement.
Yep, there's a good report out, Robbie, from Eunomia Research, if people want to Google it, and it's how a container return scheme or how a DRS affects curbside recycling. And it was done as a study in Scotland. But the long and the short of it is that it enhances the curbside scheme. The collector collects less material, but it's more valuable, as you're saying. I got another question here from Hannah and Liam. How do we use the scheme to help us get back to more reusable and refillables? Is it a stepping stone for that, Robbie, or how do we use the scheme best to get in that direction? Is what we want is more reusables, more refillables.
Well, I did have the privilege of working with Hannah Blumhardt in around on the technical advisory group, and I can tell everyone that she's a strong advocate for getting refills back into the scheme, and that is certainly possible. You have to have a deposit. You have to have a refund as your starting point for getting refills back to be refilled. So you've got the starting point if we get a refund on bottles and cans. There are some examples where it's only happening voluntarily. I'm not in favor of a voluntary approach. I think there's just too much motivation for producers to use single-use plastic. So it's an area which has to be really pushed through the government, and it's something that for sure is possible. And in fact, something like 25% of containers across Europe are still refill, and there's still a substantial amount of refill through Asia, but it is dropping off. Reloop did a report last year that it is dropping off substantially, and producers don't really like refill, so it's a battle.
Okay. Hey, I've got one here from Graham Burrell, and he was saying, I thought fresh milk is not included in Australia. Just before you answer that, Robbie, I'm going to say that I grew up in Alberta, and we had the scheme developed there in the 70s, and the milk industry lobbied hard to stay out of the scheme. So what the scheme manager said is, if you can't get up to 75% in 6 years or whatever it is, then we're going to pull you into the scheme. And they never did make it. So they got pulled into the scheme. So every single container in Alberta is in the scheme, whether it's a box of wine, a bottle of milk, or a bottle of spirits, it's all in. But anyway, if you can answer, is that true for Australia?
Yeah, sorry, that is absolutely true, Graham, that white milk is not included in Australia. On the advisory groups that I saw, Fonterra was involved, and they seemed quite okay. I don't know the latest because I haven't been there for a long time, but Fonterra seemed sort of okay about being included. The reason for excluding white milk are two. One, there was a perception of, we don't want to be increasing the price for consumers of, that day-to-day kind of white milk. Flavored milks are in, and the other thing is that white milk was generally consumed at home. A lot of the driver for CRS or DRS in Australia was litter reduction, and there was a perception that white milk isn't littered. Those containers aren't littered, so it had access to the curbside bin. So yeah, it's not included, and I can't see that it will be. The big agenda here is getting wine and spirits into those schemes.
Thanks, Robbie. Got one from Therese Mangos. Hi, Therese, good morning. Thanks for joining us. Says, Kia ora. What is your experience with working with island nations, say Norfolk, for example, Norfolk Island, and dealing with distance from the market? You've done any of that, Robbie?
Nothing at all. In fact, it's a really good question. I'm assuming that Norfolk
Doesn't Fiji have a scheme though?
Fiji has a scheme. Fiji has a really amazing refills program as well, for what it's worth. I'll make that video available I just saw recently. I haven't dealt with any of the islands, and certainly in Tassie we've got a couple of islands, Flinders Island, King Island, fairly small populations, and they'll be included. The facility there is likely to be the landfill. I think they have a tip shop at the landfill there. So that's where you'd probably see a facility like that. But yeah, I mean, look, I guess the obvious thing here is reverse logistics. Those islands are hugely dependent on food coming into them and other goods, and containers leave. So you should be able to backfill there.
I guess that's a good argument for refillables too, isn't it, Robbie?
Yeah, and that, as I say, that there's a really amazing program in Fiji for refills, and it does save them money, and they're getting good returns in terms of numbers of use. Yeah.
All right, I'm just going through these chats as they come in. Questions. Another one from Graham. Is there a model that we can look at, the perfect CRS CDS for New Zealand? What's the perfect model? Is there one out there in the world, Robbie, that you could say this is a really great one?
Well, so if you look at the German scheme at 98%, you can't go past Germany in terms of achievement. Yeah, it's pretty obvious at 98. I think it's 98.5 or something like this, right? The only leftover containers ones that kids are making a bottle out of or something, they're making a boat out of or something, right? There's not much left. Their refund value, though, the deposit value is something like 40 cents. Yeah. So it's huge. You know, that's a big motivator. If there's nothing left on the street at 40 cents, you pick up 10 and you've got a pie for lunch, or you know what I mean? It's quite a big one. And of course the collection network is retail based and all of those sort of things. So whether you need a scheme as massive as sort of super efficient as that to achieve that 90% plus in New Zealand, I suspect you probably don't need it to be that, that big a deposit level, that number of collection points, and, that level of convenience. You might get up there sort of, with maybe 20 cents is going to be okay, at least to get going. But what you need is flexibility to adjust it as you go along. So there has to be something in legislation so that when the inflationary impacts of a 20-cent deposit in 2030 hit, it's going to 30 cents, it's going to 40 cents.
Thanks, Robbie. We got about 5 minutes left, and we're going to go right down to the wire today because there's still questions coming in. So that was one from Ali was, if 20 cents or 20 euros is a great driver incentive in Europe and $1 is unrealistic, basically saying that 20 cents here is the starting point for you, but it's not the end point. Like in 10 years, you got to future-proof these things. Is that right, Robbie?
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be adjusted. One of the penalties, which I think is really exciting, if they doesn't achieve a level of target or whatever it is that some states have doubled you just put into legislation that if it's not at 90% within whatever time period, then the deposit's going to be doubled. That's a big motivator for the scheme to be really effective, and a big motivator for producers to get out of the way. There's got to be a role for drinks producers in these schemes, but don't let them get in charge of it, because the motivation is not there to get what we want and the environment wants and the community wants, is to get their refund back, to get litter down, to get recycling rates up.
Robbie, I got one from Romilly. Welcome, Romilly. Kiwi Bottle Drive has a petition going to urge Minister Parker to create us a comprehensive CRS with a 20-cent deposit. If you haven't already, please add your voice to Kiwi Bottle Drive. So the link is in the chat box, but you can just Google Kiwi Bottle Drive and get in and be a part of that voice to the minister saying, 10 cents is old school. If we're going to get the highest return rate, we need a high deposit rate, and we need convenient locations. Got another one here from Gary Kelk. Welcome, Gary. Can Robbie discuss the size limits on bottles around the world? So what's the range, Robbie? What works? I know here you don't want to have a minimum, because if it's 300 mils, you just start putting your beer in 296 mil bottles and you're out of the scheme, right?
Yeah. So the issue here is we've landed on 150 mil to 3 liters. I guess that covers the sort of vast majority. The reason for that is that we have these Yakult little bottles in South Australia, and they've all had a 10-cent deposit. And there was a big sort of pushback from industry to not have them in. So the level in Australian states might be some variation. I'm just trying to think, but 150 mil to 3 liters.
I think the New Zealand recommendations is no minimum at this stage, is my understanding.
Right, okay.
But whether that happens or not, who knows? But I know that if you put a minimum size, like 300 mils or 250 mils, you can make your bottle 249 mils and you don't have to be in the scheme.
Yeah.
And that's the argument for no minimum size.
Yeah.
Okay, I got another question here. Dorda, I remember being astounded that in Germany, public bins have little ledges on the bottom, so people who are out and about, don't want to redeem their deposit, can place their containers for other people to pick them up. Dorda, they're all over Canada too. They put little cages on the rubbish bins, public street litter bins, or Canadians will just put them on top of the bin or beside the bin, so that people that want to collect them, they don't have to dig through the bins. Is that true? You got any in Aussie like that? Design bins, or hadn't thought about it?
Not really. What I have understood though is that in South Australia, where we've got a really long history of this, there are sort of disadvantaged people who have patches, and consumers often leave their containers next to their curbside bins, and these patches sort of develop where Dave or whoever it might be sort of runs a particular patch and makes a sort of income off that. I have also seen in New South Wales, I went and saw one depot up there on one occasion. There was a woman that comes in twice a week with about 500 containers or something like that in the back of her car that her friends kind of get to. But I haven't seen that sort of designed bins at this particular stage. Yeah.
I got a comment from Cat Miller. It says 40 to 50 cents shows the value of keeping these away from causing pollution. I don't think they'd be out in the environment very long if they were worth 50 cents, would they, Robbie? Wouldn't be any plastic bottles blowing around the beach or gutters. I've got a question here from Carolyn. We're hearing refund values, but not as a percent of the retail price. I believe New Zealand drink prices are higher than most parts of the world, so maybe we can sustain a higher refund price. And I guess, Carolyn, you got to remember that the same deposit would be on a $60 bottle of wine as would be on a $2 drink, wouldn't it, Robbie?
Yeah, I think what GDP is a really good indicator of that too. What is the motivator? GDP per capita. And again, it's just an obvious thing, isn't it? What is going to motivate the New Zealand consumer? And it is really interesting. Even though there's financial gain in there, one of the things that I don't think has been really effectively communicated, and I think maybe won't go beyond the kind of really engaged network like this, is the value of putting material through the container deposit scheme rather than the curbside scheme, because the quality of the material is a lot higher. The levels of contamination, you've got material separation right there and then. So generally in South Australia, historically, there's always been a premium, and there is now in the other CDS states, for the material coming out of the CD network is worth more than even the eligible containers coming out of the curbside network. And I think, that hasn't been well communicated. Put your material through the CDS network. It's going to be higher quality. It's more likely to go back to bottle recycling than to say road base, right? I don't know in New Zealand, but in Australia, our roads are the sort of repository of every piece of junk that we can't utilize. Now, printed cartridges and glass and plastic and everything, sort of the roads are sort of being seen as this sort of place, but we really want it to go back to higher order circular economy outcomes. And
absolutely.
delivers that.
Roading is not a circular economy. Putting high quality materials like glass into roads is not a circular economy. We've got enough rocks in this country to build roads. Let's make more bottles out of it. Robbie, we're going to wrap up now. I just want to thank you for an awesome session. I'm sorry I can't get to every single question, although very quickly there was a question about what about jam jars and other things, why aren't they in? You've got to remember that container return schemes or deposit return schemes were initially targeted to combat litter, and in New Zealand we drink about 2.3 billion a year beverage containers, and about 1 billion are drank outside the home. It was to try and get those ones. We're not walking around with jam jars out in the park, so those could be added on, shampoo bottles and other things at some stage, but at the moment it's beverage containers, because in most places they're the second highest littered item after cigarette butts. So we're going to wrap up here, Robbie. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. We got through the technical difficulties. I want to thank Dorta and Ali and Izzy, our team that have put this online Hui together in a heartbeat after we got locked down and we couldn't meet in person. So thank you, everyone. Dorta, I would just like you to come on just to finish up, just to perhaps let us know what's going on for the rest of the day, if you don't mind, and then we'll close out.
Sure. Well, it's the Marty Hoffert show at 1 p.m. We have our AGM facilitated by our great chairman. And then tomorrow we've got a climate change session. So we're kind of coming to the tail end of the Hui. And all of the details are on the website.
Thank you, Dorta. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Robbie. And have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.